Hi there. Tonight, we're stepping back through the centuries to explore one of humanity's most fundamental challenges: sleep during medieval winters. Picture yourself not in your comfortable modern bed, but in a world where the cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a life-threatening force that shaped every aspect of how people rested. You're about to discover that medieval sleep wasn't the peaceful, private affair we know today. It was a communal, strategic, and often desperate attempt to survive the long, dark nights when temperatures plummeted and the line between warmth and death grew dangerously thin. Before we begin this journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights. Let your breath slow. Settle into your pillow. Tonight, you'll experience what it truly meant to seek rest in an era when winter was not a season to endure, but a siege to survive. Imagine yourself standing in a medieval village as twilight falls. The year is 1340, somewhere in northern France or England. The air carries that particular sharpness that tells you winter has truly arrived. Your breath forms clouds before your face. The ground beneath your feet is frozen solid, and the trees stand bare and skeletal against a sky that darkens earlier each day. You're exhausted. You've worked since before dawn, hauling water, tending animals, preparing food, spinning wool. Your hands are chapped and raw. Your back aches. And now, as the last light fades, you face the challenge that every medieval person confronted: how to sleep through a night that could easily kill you. This isn't dramatic exaggeration. Winter mortality rates in medieval Europe were significantly higher than summer rates. The cold claimed lives, especially the young, the old, and the vulnerable. Sleep during these months wasn't merely about rest. It was about survival strategy, about carefully constructed rituals and technologies that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep in your warm bed, you'll walk alongside those medieval sleepers. You'll discover their ingenious solutions, their desperate measures, their small victories, and their tragic failures. You'll learn what it meant to close your eyes in a world where morning was never guaranteed. The story we're about to explore is drawn from historical records, archaeological evidence, and scholarly research. Where historians debate or evidence remains unclear, I'll share those uncertainties. This isn't fantasy, it's the real, complicated, fascinating story of how humans slept when winter was their greatest enemy. So settle in. Let the warmth of your blankets surround you. And prepare to appreciate, perhaps for the first time, the extraordinary gift of a safe, warm night's sleep. You're standing inside a typical medieval peasant dwelling. The year is around 1350, and you're somewhere in rural England, though the scene would be similar across much of northern Europe. This will be your shelter for the night. The building itself is modest, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. The walls are constructed using a technique called wattle and daub, wooden posts driven into the ground, with woven branches forming a lattice between them, the whole thing plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, dung, and sometimes lime. When properly maintained, these walls can be surprisingly effective insulators. But here's what historians note. Maintenance was constant work, and many families, exhausted by the demands of survival, let repairs slide. Cracks appeared, gaps opened, and through these imperfections, winter crept in like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. The roof above you is thatched, bundles of reeds or straw laid in overlapping layers. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years and provided excellent insulation when dry. But winter brought rain, snow, and dampness. Thatch absorbed moisture, grew heavy, sometimes collapsed. And wet thatch lost much of its insulating power. Let your eyes adjust to the dim interior. There's a single room here, not bedrooms and living spaces as we know them, but one multipurpose area where all life unfolds. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, sometimes mixed with crushed stone or clay. Some households laid down rushes or straw to provide a bit of cushioning and insulation from the ground's cold. Now notice the door. It's made of rough planks, probably hung on leather hinges. It doesn't fit perfectly into its frame. You can feel the draft creeping around its edges, a persistent reminder that the outside world is never truly kept at bay. Some families hung a heavy cloth or hide behind the door for added protection, but this was a luxury not everyone could afford. The windows are another story entirely. Glass windows were extraordinarily rare in peasant homes, reserved for churches, castles, and the wealthiest merchants. Your windows are simply holes in the walls, perhaps with wooden shutters that can be closed against the worst weather. But closing the shutters means losing what little daylight penetrates this space. It's a constant trade-off, light and ventilation, or warmth and darkness. Some households used oiled cloth or animal bladders stretched across the window openings. These materials allowed a dim, yellowish light to filter through while blocking some of the wind. But they were fragile, expensive to replace, and still far from effective barriers against winter's assault. Look around this space and you'll notice the absence of what we'd consider essential. There are no multiple rooms where you could retreat from the cold. No insulated walls. No double glazing. No central heating. No thermostats. The technology of warmth was primitive, labor-intensive, and never quite adequate. Historians still debate how cold these dwellings actually became. Some research suggests interior temperatures might have hovered around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 10 degrees Celsius, on winter nights, cold enough to be deeply uncomfortable but not immediately life-threatening for healthy adults. Others argue that temperatures could drop much lower, especially during the coldest spells that medieval chroniclers occasionally recorded. What we know for certain is that medieval people felt the cold acutely. Their letters, when literacy allowed such records, speak of it frequently. Monastic chronicles mention winters of unusual severity. Court records occasionally note deaths from exposure. The cold was real, persistent, and dangerous. Now, here's a detail that often surprises modern readers. In some ways, these humble peasant dwellings could be warmer than the stone castles and manor houses of the nobility. That seems counterintuitive. Surely wealth brought comfort? But consider the physics. A small space is easier to heat than a large one. A peasant cottage with a central hearth fire might warm the entire interior to some degree. Meanwhile, a noble sleeping in a vast stone chamber might have a blazing fireplace and still shiver, because most of the heat escaped through the enormous volume of cold air and the stone walls that acted as massive heat sinks. Medieval people understood this, even without our modern physics. There's a wonderful moment in a 15th century letter where a traveling merchant writes about preferring to sleep in a peasant's cottage rather than accept hospitality in a drafty castle. He notes, with wry amusement, that poverty sometimes brought unexpected comforts. But let's not romanticize peasant housing. These were difficult, uncomfortable spaces to inhabit in winter. The smell inside would have been intense: smoke from the fire, unwashed bodies, animals that sometimes shared the space, more on that later, food storage, waste. Medieval noses were accustomed to odors that would overwhelm most modern people. The ceiling height was low, which helped with heating but made the space feel cramped and smoky. Smoke from the central hearth was meant to rise and escape through holes in the roof, but on still days or when the wind blew wrong, the interior became a hazy, eye-watering environment. You'd feel the dampness too. Medieval buildings, without modern drainage or damp-proof courses, absorbed moisture from the ground. In winter, this meant walls could feel cold and slightly wet to the touch. Some families tried to combat this by laying down extra straw or hanging cloth against the walls, but it was a constant battle. Regional variations existed, of course. In Scandinavia, longhouses developed different heating strategies, with some buildings incorporating the body heat of livestock into their thermal design. In Mediterranean regions, where winters were milder, the challenges were different: cold rain rather than snow, but often inadequate heating for the genuinely cold nights that did occur. In mountainous areas, households sometimes built partially underground or into hillsides, using the earth's natural insulation. These semi-subterranean dwellings could be surprisingly warm, though they brought their own challenges with ventilation and dampness. Some scholarly sources suggest that medieval builders possessed more sophisticated understanding of passive thermal design than we often credit them with. The orientation of buildings, the placement of doors and windows, the thickness of walls in different regions, all show signs of adaptation to local climate challenges. But even with this accumulated wisdom, even with the best-built cottage, winter nights remained fundamentally uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. The architecture provided a framework for survival, but it took much more than walls and a roof to make it through a medieval winter night. Stand here in this medieval dwelling as darkness falls completely. Feel how the temperature drops as the sun disappears. Notice how everyone in the household begins to move with purpose, enacting rituals of preparation that have been refined through generations of winter survivors. This is where your night begins. In a space that is part shelter, part trap, where the line between life-preserving refuge and inadequate protection remains frightfully thin. The cold is coming. And now we'll discover how medieval people fought back. The most important object in any medieval dwelling wasn't a bed, wasn't a door, wasn't even the roof overhead. It was the hearth fire. Everything, absolutely everything, revolved around this flame. You're looking at it now, this critical lifeline. In a peasant cottage, the hearth typically sat in the center of the room or against one wall. It might be nothing more than a few stones arranged to contain the fire, with the smoke rising toward a hole in the roof. Wealthier households might have a more elaborate setup with a partial chimney, but even these were rare in peasant homes before the late medieval period. The fire in front of you is built from wood, most likely whatever local forests could provide. Oak burns hot and long, making it ideal but also valuable for construction and therefore sometimes scarce. Beech, ash, and other hardwoods were prized. Softwoods like pine burned faster and produced more smoke, but in regions where that's what grew, you burned what you had. Gathering firewood was a year-round occupation that intensified in autumn as households prepared for winter. The labor involved was staggering. Some estimates suggest a medieval household might need several tons of wood to survive a winter, depending on the severity of the climate, the efficiency of the hearth, and the size of the dwelling. This created complex social and economic dynamics. Many forests were controlled by lords who restricted what peasants could gather. Dead wood and fallen branches were often allowed, but cutting living trees might be forbidden or require payment. These forest laws shaped medieval life in countless ways and generated persistent tensions between those who owned land and those who needed fuel. Some families supplemented wood with peat, partially decomposed plant matter cut from bogs, dried and burned. Peat burns with a distinctive, smoky smell and provides decent heat, though it requires different fire management than wood. In regions like Ireland and parts of Scotland and northern England, peat was a crucial fuel source. Coal existed and was used in medieval England, particularly in areas where it could be easily surface mined. But it was less common than wood and often considered inferior, smokier, dirtier, and tricky to manage. The coal industry wouldn't really transform European heating until the later medieval period and beyond. Now, maintaining the fire through a winter night was an art and a challenge. Let the fire die completely, and relighting it was difficult. Medieval fire-starting methods, striking flint and steel to create sparks that could ignite tinder, required skill, patience, and dry materials. On a damp winter morning, this could be a prolonged, frustrating process. So the goal was to keep the fire alive through the night. This was done by banking, carefully arranging the logs and coals, possibly covering them with ash, to create a slow-burning configuration that would maintain embers until morning. Banking a fire properly was crucial knowledge passed from parents to children. But here's the challenge historians emphasize. A banked fire provided much less heat than an active fire. The household faced a difficult choice. Keep the fire blazing for warmth, but risk using up too much precious fuel and requiring someone to stay awake feeding it. Or bank it carefully and endure greater cold, gambling that the reduced heat would still keep everyone alive until morning. Many households compromised. The fire would burn actively during the evening hours when the family gathered for their last meal of the day. Then, as people prepared for sleep, someone would bank it. Through the night, one person, perhaps rotating through family members, might rise once or twice to add wood and stir the embers. The smoke is something you'd notice immediately. Medieval hearths without proper chimneys filled living spaces with smoke. It rose toward the roof holes, yes, but it also hung in the air, especially on damp or windless days. Your eyes would water. Your throat would feel scratchy. Your clothes, hair, and skin would absorb the smell until it became part of your very being. There's an ongoing scholarly discussion about the health impacts of this constant smoke exposure. Some evidence suggests medieval people suffered from respiratory problems, though teasing apart the effects of smoke from other factors, disease, dust, malnutrition, is challenging. What's clear is that they adapted, whether through physiological tolerance or simply acceptance, to living in environments that modern safety regulations would evacuate immediately. The smoke did have one unexpected benefit. It helped preserve the thatched roof. The chemicals in wood smoke acted as a preservative and pesticide, deterring insects and slowing rot. A frequently used hearth essentially cured the thatch above it. Positioning yourself for sleep in relation to the hearth was a strategic decision. Too close, and you'd be too hot, possibly at risk from sparks. Too far and you'd freeze. Medieval people developed keen senses of the optimal distance. Close enough to benefit from radiant heat, far enough to be safe. Children, the elderly, and the sick often got priority positions nearest the fire. This wasn't pure altruism, it was pragmatic survival strategy. These vulnerable individuals had the least ability to generate their own body heat and the highest risk of cold-related death or illness. There were dangers beyond smoke. House fires were a genuine and frequent threat in medieval communities. Sparks escaping the hearth, thatched roofs catching fire, embers rolling across straw-covered floors, all could turn a shelter into a death trap within minutes. Medieval villages experienced devastating fires with grim regularity. The closely packed buildings, combustible construction materials, and dependence on open flames created perfect conditions for disaster. Some town regulations attempted to mandate stone hearths or fire-resistant construction, but enforcement was uneven and materials expensive. Despite these dangers, the alternative, attempting to sleep without fire, was generally considered more dangerous than the risks fire itself posed. In severe cold, hypothermia could kill within hours. Fire might kill you, but cold certainly would. There's a touching detail in some medieval household accounts and inventories, the careful listing of fire tools, pokers, tongs, bellows. These weren't mere possessions. They were survival equipment as crucial as any weapon. The ability to manage fire effectively could mean the difference between a household that thrived and one that perished. Some families developed elaborate systems of fire safety. Heavy cloths or hides might be positioned to catch sparks. Children might be taught from an early age to respect the fire's boundary. In some regions, households kept buckets of water, sand, or earth nearby for emergencies. The sound of the hearth fire would become a comforting presence as you settled for sleep. The crackle and pop of burning wood, the occasional whoosh as flames found new fuel, the subtle shifting of logs, these sounds marked the night as surely as any clock. You'd watch the flames dance and flicker, creating moving shadows on the walls. In the pre-electric age, firelight was the main illumination after dark. Its warm, orange glow was softer than modern lighting, easier on eyes adjusted to darkness. Some scholars argue that the medieval relationship with fire was almost spiritual. Fire represented life, warmth, safety, and community. The hearth was where families gathered, where food was prepared, where stories were told. Keeping the home fires burning was both a practical necessity and a symbolic act of continuity. There's evidence that some households had small rituals around the fire. Prayers might be offered when banking it for the night, asking for protection, for the fire to last, for safety from conflagration. In some regions, offerings might be made to household spirits or deities associated with the hearth. The seasonal management of fire also mattered. In deep winter, when fuel supplies dwindled and restocking was difficult due to snow and frozen ground, households became more conservative with fire use. Spring brought relief but also a new concern. As temperatures rose, the need for constant fire decreased, allowing households to replenish their depleted wood supplies for the next winter. Think of the mental calculation involved. How cold is tonight? How much wood do we have left? How many weeks until spring? Can we afford to burn more tonight, or must we conserve? These weren't abstract questions. They could determine survival. Some families tried to coordinate with neighbors, sharing fire if one household's failed or trading wood for other necessities. Community networks of mutual aid were crucial survival mechanisms, though they also created obligations and power dynamics that could be complex and sometimes fraught. As you prepare to leave the hearth and move toward your sleeping place, take one last look at the flames. This fire has been kept alive through knowledge hard-won over generations. The person who taught you to bank it learned from their parents, who learned from theirs, stretching back through time. This isn't just a fire. It's a legacy of survival, a testament to human ingenuity and determination. It's the thin orange line between life and death on a winter night in medieval Europe. And now, with the fire banked and darkness settling completely, it's time to discover how medieval people attempted to sleep in the cold that no fire could fully banish. Now we turn to the medieval bed itself, what it was, where it was placed, and how it attempted to create a cocoon of survivable warmth in an environment fundamentally hostile to comfort. First, let's address a common misconception. When we say medieval bed, many people picture elaborate four-poster constructions with heavy curtains, the kind you see in museums or period films. These certainly existed, but they were luxuries of the wealthy. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, beds were far simpler affairs. You're looking at what most peasants slept on, a roughly constructed frame, if you're fortunate, raised off the ground on simple legs or blocks. The mattress is a large sack, sometimes called a tick or pallet, stuffed with straw, dried grass, leaves, or if you're particularly well off, feathers. The straw-filled mattress was by far the most common. After each harvest, fresh straw became available, and many households would refresh their sleeping ticks. But throughout the long winter, that straw compacted, broke down, and attracted various unwanted residents, lice, fleas, and other insects that medieval people accepted as inevitable. There's ongoing scholarly discussion about medieval people's attitudes toward these pests. Some sources suggest a degree of resigned tolerance. Everyone had them, they were just part of life. Other evidence points to real efforts at pest control. Periodic burning and replacement of bedding, certain herbs thought to repel insects, even attempts at what we might call hygiene, though medieval understanding of how pests spread disease was limited. The mattress rested either directly on a wooden platform or, in better setups, on a lattice of ropes stretched across the bed frame. These rope systems had to be periodically tightened as they stretched with use. This is likely the origin of the phrase, sleep tight. A sagging rope bed meant an uncomfortable night with body close to the cold floor or frame. Some of the poorest individuals slept directly on the floor on a thin pallet or pile of straw with no frame at all. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites has found sleeping areas where the floor was slightly sunken or worn, suggesting people bedded down in the same spots repeatedly. Now, raising the bed off the floor wasn't just about comfort, it was about thermal strategy. Remember how cold air sinks? The air closest to the floor was the coldest in the room. By sleeping on a raised platform, you positioned yourself in a slightly warmer zone. Every inch of height helped. But the real genius of medieval cold weather sleeping came in the layering of materials above and around the sleeper. This is where we see true ingenuity. Start with what you're lying on. Over the straw mattress, there might be a sheet, if the household possessed such a thing, made from coarse linen. Linen was produced throughout medieval Europe from flax, and while it could be woven finely for the wealthy, most peasant linen was rough and serviceable. Now, the covers. Medieval people understood the insulating power of multiple layers, even if they didn't phrase it in terms of thermal physics. They built up bedding in layers. Blankets of wool, most commonly, because wool retains warmth even when damp, a crucial property in the consistently humid medieval dwelling. The quality of wool varied enormously. Fine wool from specialized breeds commanded high prices and made soft, warm cloth. Coarse wool from local sheep was scratchy, sometimes almost felt like in its thickness, but still functional. Many households produced their own woolen cloth through the laborious process of shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving, occupations that dominated much of life, especially for women. Over the wool blankets, wealthier peasants or those who'd saved might add furs or sheepskins. These were precious possessions, sometimes mentioned specifically in wills and inheritance documents. A good fur could make an enormous difference in survivability. Some households created quilts, layers of fabric with wool, feathers, or other materials between them, stitched together in patterns that held the stuffing in place. These took considerable time and skill to make, representing significant investment of labor. The sheer weight of medieval bedding often surprises people when they see it in museums or historical recreations. Multiple wool blankets, furs, and quilts could weigh 30 or 40 pounds, a heavy, somewhat oppressive mass that pinned you in place. But this weight was intentional. It pressed the layers together, reducing air gaps and maximizing insulation. For those wealthy enough to have them, bed curtains were another crucial layer in the thermal strategy. We've already mentioned how the nobility might have elaborate four-poster beds with heavy draperies. But even modest households sometimes hung cloth around their sleeping areas. These curtains served multiple purposes. They blocked drafts. They created a smaller space that your body heat could more effectively warm. They provided a psychological sense of privacy and protection in the single-room dwelling where multiple family members and possibly even animals shared space. And they offered a surface that could be drawn close, creating a kind of tent within which you slept. The fabric of bed curtains ranged from fine wool for the wealthy to much coarser materials, sometimes just old cloaks or worn clothing repurposed, for ordinary people. What mattered was creating that barrier, that extra layer between sleeper and the frigid air beyond. Imagine pulling the curtains closed around your bed as night deepens. Inside this enclosed space, your breath and body heat begin to accumulate. It's not truly warm, not by modern standards, but it's noticeably less cold than the room beyond. This microenvironment could be 5 or even 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding space, and that difference mattered enormously. There's a fascinating detail in some medieval sources about people sleeping in their day clothes. The idea of special sleeping garments, nightshirts or nightgowns, was mostly a luxury. Many people simply lay down in the same tunic or dress they'd worn all day, removing at most their outer layer. Some slept in shifts, a kind of long undergarment, but others went to bed fully clothed, minus shoes. In extreme cold, you might even keep your cloak on. The priority was staying warm, and extra layers of clothing added insulation. Headwear during sleep was common. A woolen cap helped retain body heat, since significant warmth is lost through the head. Some sources describe sleeping caps as essential items, not mere decoration. Now, here's where we need to discuss the remarkable medieval strategy of communal sleeping. In many households, everyone didn't have individual beds. Families slept together, parents with young children, siblings sharing, sometimes even unrelated individuals if the household was large or accommodating travelers. This wasn't primarily about space conservation, though that was a factor. It was about heat. Multiple bodies in close proximity generated and shared warmth. What one person's metabolism produced benefited the others. On the coldest nights, this communal sleeping could be life-saving, particularly for the young, elderly, or sick who couldn't generate sufficient body heat alone. There were downsides, of course. Privacy was non-existent. Noise, movement, snoring, and other disturbances meant sleep was often fragmented. But the trade-off, survival, was worth it. Some scholars have explored the social and psychological dimensions of this communal sleeping. What we consider deeply intimate, sharing a bed, was, for medieval people, completely ordinary. The nuclear family in separate bedrooms is a much more recent development. Now, we must also mention the animals. In many peasant households, particularly in severe climates, valuable livestock might be brought inside the dwelling in winter. Cows, sheep, goats, or pigs would be housed at one end of the room or in an attached space with access to the main living area. This served multiple purposes. It protected valuable animals from theft and cold. And, crucially, large animals generate significant body heat. A cow produces roughly the same heat as a small space heater, about 1,500 watts under normal conditions. Having even 1 or 2 cows inside could noticeably warm the dwelling. Yes, it meant living with the smell, the noise, and the mess of animals. But medieval people, whose entire lives involved constant proximity to livestock, accepted this as normal. The warmth was worth the odor. Smaller animals, dogs and cats, were even more directly integrated into sleeping arrangements. Dogs particularly were valued as bed warmers. Their body heat, loyalty, keeping them in place throughout the night, and fur made them excellent heat sources. There's truth to the old expression about 3-dog nights. On the coldest nights, you'd want 3 dogs in bed with you to survive. Cats, though less commonly kept than dogs in the medieval period, also served this warming function when present. Medieval attitudes toward cats were complex and changed over time, but their utility in controlling pests and providing warmth was recognized. Some wealthy individuals used hot water bottles, containers filled with hot water from the fire, wrapped in cloth, and placed in the bed before sleeping. Warming pans, long-handled covered pans filled with hot coals, could be run between the sheets to warm them before retiring. But these were genuine luxuries, mostly known in urban settings or wealthier households. More accessible was the use of heated stones. Smooth river rocks or hearthstones could be heated in or beside the fire, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns, and placed at the foot of the bed. They'd retain heat for several hours, long enough to help you fall asleep. By morning they'd be cold, but those first crucial hours of warmth could make the difference between sleep and miserable wakefulness. Let's pause and consider what this all means. The medieval bed was not a single object but a system, a carefully assembled collection of materials and strategies, all working together to create a survivable sleeping environment. Every element, from the raised frame to the layered bedding to the curtains to the shared body heat, represented solutions to the fundamental problem of staying alive through a winter night. And yet, despite all these measures, sleep was still often cold. You'd wake multiple times through the night as discomfort, cold extremities, or the need to tend the fire interrupted rest. Deep, untroubled sleep through an entire winter night was probably rare for most medieval people. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests that medieval people had different sleep patterns than we do today. The concept of first sleep and second sleep, sleeping in 2 distinct periods with a wakeful interval between, appears in many medieval sources. During that wakeful period, people might pray, talk quietly, make love, or simply lie thinking. Some scholars speculate this segmented sleep pattern was partly an adaptation to the challenges of medieval sleeping conditions. You'd sleep until cold or discomfort woke you, stay awake for a while tending the fire or adjusting bedding, then sleep again until dawn. As you lie here imagining yourself in this medieval bed, feel the weight of the blankets pressing down. Feel the scratch of wool against your skin. Hear the rustle of straw beneath you as you shift position. Smell the combination of smoke, wool, unwashed bodies, and animals that fills the air. Notice how your toes are cold despite everything. They're furthest from your core, hardest to keep warm. Your nose feels chilled too, exposed to the ambient air despite the cocoon you've built around yourself. This is medieval sleep. Not peaceful, not restful by modern standards, but survivable. And that survival represents centuries of accumulated knowledge, of trial and error, of human stubbornness in the face of a hostile environment. Now, let's discover what else medieval people did to improve their chances of seeing another dawn. While the central hearth fire was crucial, medieval people developed other heating strategies and technologies, some surprisingly sophisticated, others simply clever adaptations to available resources. Let's start with bed warmers, which we touched on briefly earlier but deserve more attention. The wealthy, and we're talking about the upper merchant class and nobility here, not peasants, had access to several types of portable heat sources. The warming pan was perhaps the most common among those who could afford it. Picture a flat, covered metal pan on a long handle. Hot coals from the fire were placed inside, and the pan was moved between the bed sheets, warming them before the sleeper got in. This required careful technique. Too slow, and the coals cooled. Too fast, and they might scorch the linens or even start a fire. Servants who handled warming pans needed training. There are occasional mentions in household accounts of accidents, singed sheets, minor burns. But when done properly, a warming pan could transform a bed from an icy torture device into something approaching comfort. For those without metal warming pans, heated stones or bricks served similar purposes. Archaeological sites sometimes yield smooth stones showing evidence of repeated heating. These bed stones were wrapped in cloth or wool to prevent direct skin contact and placed at strategic locations in the bed, most commonly at the feet, since cold extremities interfered most with falling asleep. The heat capacity of stone is considerable. A good-sized rock heated thoroughly at the fire could remain warm for 4 to 6 hours. This wouldn't last the whole night, but it covered the crucial period of falling asleep and early night sleeping, when people were most vulnerable to cold. Some households boiled water in ceramic or metal containers, then sealed these hot water bottles and placed them in beds. This approach was less common than heated stones, primarily because suitable waterproof containers were expensive and could crack from thermal stress. Now, let's discuss a heating technology that might surprise you: the brazier. This is essentially a metal basket or container that held burning coals, sometimes with a protective cage or cover. Braziers could be moved around the dwelling, providing portable heat. The wealthy sometimes had multiple braziers in their chambers. Medieval illustrations show people warming their hands over braziers, or having servants carry them from room to room. In churches and other large stone buildings, braziers provided localized warmth for those who could afford to rent or own them. But braziers came with serious risks. The carbon monoxide they produced could be deadly in enclosed spaces, especially while sleeping. There are occasional references in medieval sources to deaths from bad air, probably carbon monoxide poisoning from braziers or poorly ventilated fires. Medieval people seem to have some awareness of this danger, even without understanding the chemistry. Recommendations to ensure proper ventilation and not to sleep with braziers burning unattended appear in various sources. Yet the temptation of warmth sometimes outweighed caution, with tragic results. Another heating strategy involved the strategic use of fabric and tapestries. The wealthy hung elaborate tapestries on walls, and while these certainly served aesthetic and status display purposes, they also had practical value as insulation. A thick woolen tapestry against a cold stone wall created a dead air space, an insulating layer that reduced heat loss through the wall. Multiple tapestries in a room could noticeably moderate temperature. Some sources suggest rooms were prepared for winter by hanging additional cloth on walls and over doorways. For those who couldn't afford tapestries, simpler cloth hangings served the same purpose. Even old cloaks or worn blankets, nailed or tied against walls, provided some insulation. This wasn't elegant, but it worked. Sealing drafts was another crucial technology, though technology might be too grand a word for stuffing cracks with whatever materials were at hand. Rope, cloth strips, moss, wool, mud, anything that could block air movement was fair game. Windows, as we've mentioned, were particularly problematic. Wooden shutters helped but rarely sealed perfectly. Some households created removable winter panels, wooden boards or frames covered with oiled cloth or parchment, that fitted over windows to provide extra protection during the coldest months. Doors received similar treatment. Heavy curtains or hides hung behind doors blocked drafts. Some households in extreme climates created double-door entry systems, a small vestibule or porch that created an airlock, preventing cold air from blasting directly into the main living space when anyone entered or exited. Now, here's something fascinating that scholars are still piecing together. Evidence suggests some medieval builders understood passive solar design. Buildings in certain regions were oriented to maximize winter sun exposure. Small windows might be positioned to catch morning or afternoon sun. Dark-colored stone or clay in strategic locations could absorb and radiate solar heat. This knowledge was probably empirical rather than theoretical. Builders didn't understand thermodynamics, but they knew from experience that houses facing certain directions stayed warmer. This vernacular architecture, developed over generations, contained sophisticated adaptations that we're only now fully appreciating. Heating larger spaces, great halls in castles, manor houses, monasteries, presented different challenges. Large central fireplaces were common, sometimes massive enough to stand inside. But even these struggled to heat volumes of cold stone. Some castle great halls had multiple fireplaces. The truly wealthy might have them along several walls. Yet even so, historical sources frequently mention how cold these spaces were. People would cluster near the fires, leaving vast areas of the hall frigid. One partial solution was to shrink the living space in winter. Households might effectively abandon parts of their dwelling, hanging cloth to create smaller, more heatable spaces within the larger structure. This seasonal reconfiguration of living space was practical in buildings with multiple rooms. Monasteries, with their unique challenges, stone buildings, large dormitories, rules against excess comfort, developed interesting approaches. Some had heated common rooms where monks could warm themselves before and after services. Others used warming rooms where specific activities like manuscript copying could occur in relative comfort. The monastic day was punctuated by frequent services requiring walking through cold cloisters to unheated chapels. Monks' descriptions of winter hardship are frequent in surviving documents. Some monasteries eventually added hypocausts, Roman-style underfloor heating systems, though these were expensive to build and maintain. Now, let's talk about a technology that might seem too obvious to mention: layers of clothing. Medieval people used clothing not just as daytime wear but as a sleeping insulation system. As we mentioned earlier, many slept in their day clothes or in shifts. But the wealthy had specific sleeping garments, woolen gowns, sleeping caps, even lined bed socks. These weren't about modesty or fashion, they were thermal technology. The layering principle that worked for bedding also worked for body covering. Multiple thin layers trapped air better than one thick layer. A linen shift, a woolen tunic, perhaps a fur-lined surcoat, these could be worn in combination depending on the cold severity. There's a fascinating scholarly discussion about whether medieval people understood the concept of insulation as we do. They clearly practiced it, but did they theorize about it? The evidence is mixed. Some medieval texts show surprising sophistication about heat and cold, while others suggest more magical thinking. What's undeniable is that practical knowledge existed and was shared. People knew that dry wool worked better than wet wool. They knew that stillness retained heat better than moving air. They knew that multiple layers beat a single thick layer. This was wisdom encoded in practice and passed down through demonstration rather than written instruction. One more heating technology deserves mention: bed curtains, which we've discussed but which bear emphasizing. The best medieval bed curtains were thick wool, sometimes lined or padded, hung on all four sides of the bed from a frame overhead. When fully closed, these curtains created a separate thermal zone. The air inside, warmed by body heat and isolated from the room's drafts, could be 10 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. This might seem minor, but it was the difference between survival and severe cold exposure. The wealthy sometimes had bed curtains decorated with embroidery or made from expensive fabrics. But the decoration was secondary. The functional insulation was what mattered. Chronicles mention bed curtains among valuable possessions to be saved if the house caught fire, indicating how important they were considered. Some historians argue that the fully enclosed medieval bed was the most sophisticated piece of thermal technology available to ordinary people. It represented centuries of refinement: the optimal height off the floor, the right amount of enclosure, the best materials for curtains and bedding. And yet, even with all this, even with every advantage of heating technology available to medieval people, winter sleep remained fundamentally uncomfortable for most. The fire had to be tended. The cold crept in. Drafts found their way through every barrier. Medieval people lived in a kind of armed truce with winter, using every technique at their disposal to hold the cold at bay for a few hours each night. Their rest was hard-won, and morning was always a relief. As you lie in your imagined medieval bed, surrounded by the heating technologies we've discussed, the stones at your feet, the curtains drawn close, the multiple layers of wool pressing down, remember that you are experiencing the apex of medieval thermal technology, the result of countless generations learning how to survive the night. And still you're cold. Your nose is cold. Your hands, withdrawn from the covers for even a moment, grow stiff and aching. The cold is patient, relentless, always probing for a way in. This is why medieval people respected winter. It was a worthy opponent, one that killed the careless or unlucky. Surviving it meant constant vigilance, careful preparation, and a bit of luck. But people did survive. And in their survival strategies, we see remarkable human ingenuity, adaptability, and sheer stubborn determination not to surrender to the dark and cold. Now, let's explore how communities and social structures supported this nightly battle against winter's siege. Medieval sleep was rarely a solitary affair, and this communal aspect was crucial to surviving winter nights. Let's explore how social structures, family arrangements, and community practices all contributed to the nightly battle against cold. We've mentioned families sleeping together, but let's dig deeper into what this meant in practice. In a typical peasant household, let's say a family of 6 parents and 4 children of various ages, sleeping arrangements might work like this. The youngest children, being most vulnerable to cold, would sleep between or immediately beside their parents. Their smaller bodies needed the direct warmth of adult metabolism. As children grew older, they might graduate to positions slightly farther from the center, perhaps sharing a pallet or section of the family bed with siblings. Elderly parents or grandparents, if they lived with the family, and many did, as elder care meant keeping aging parents in your household, often received priority positioning near the fire. Their diminished ability to generate body heat made them vulnerable, and losing elders, repositories of knowledge and experience, was a genuine economic and social blow to the family unit. This arrangement wasn't primarily about affection, though bonds of love certainly existed. It was survival strategy, encoded in practice. The warmest sleeper was positioned to warm the coldest. The largest bodies, adults, created thermal cores that smaller bodies, children, could nestle against. Some scholarly work has explored how this sleeping arrangement might have affected medieval psychology and social structures. The lack of privacy that modern people take for granted meant that certain aspects of life, sexual intimacy, for instance, had to be managed in full awareness of other family members' presence. Medieval people developed social conventions around this. Silence during parental intimacy, for instance, or children being sent on errands to allow privacy. Curtains around beds served this purpose too, creating at least auditory and visual separation if not true isolation. But beyond individual families, larger social structures supported winter survival. In some regions, particularly in areas with extreme winters, households would informally cooperate in heating strategies. Multiple families might gather in one household on the coldest nights, bringing their bedding with them. The combined body heat of 15 or 20 people, along with a well-tended fire, could create livable conditions even in severe cold. This required social trust. You were literally sleeping beside your neighbors, and generated complex social dynamics of obligation, reciprocity, and status. Some villages had communal buildings where people could gather in extreme weather. These weren't heated separately, but the concentration of people in one space created warmth. During historic cold snaps mentioned in chronicles, entire villages might have crowded into the church or largest barn, sharing warmth until the worst passed. Monasteries and convents, with their communal dormitories, provide interesting examples of institutional approaches to winter sleep. Monks typically slept in one large room, each with a simple pallet or, in stricter orders, just a straw mattress on the floor. The rule of Street Benedict, which governed many monasteries, explicitly addressed cold weather provisions. Additional blankets could be distributed. In some houses, monks were allowed to sleep in their day robes rather than undressing. The balance between ascetic ideals and practical survival was delicately negotiated. Monastic dormitories were typically unheated, deliberately so, as part of the austere lifestyle. Yet the concentration of bodies in one space created some warmth. Monks sleeping in rows, separated by only a few feet, benefited from each other's body heat. Some monasteries eventually softened these rules. By the later Middle Ages, many houses allowed sick or elderly monks to have private cells, sometimes with small fires. This was controversial, seen by some as abandoning proper monastic rigor, but recognized by others as necessary for health and basic humanity. Hospitals and institutions caring for the sick face particular challenges. Illness already compromised the body's ability to regulate temperature. Hospital designs tried to address this through bed placement, additional bedding for the sick, and sometimes fires in the wards, though the fire risk in a building full of incapacitated people was serious. Medieval hospitals, often run by religious orders, had to balance heating expenses against limited budgets. Documentary evidence shows ongoing tension between administrative desires to conserve fuel and medical staff advocating for patients' need for warmth. Now, let's discuss an uncomfortable reality. Not everyone had equal access to warmth. Social hierarchies played out starkly in sleeping arrangements. In larger households with servants, the family slept in the main chamber while servants might sleep in less desirable spaces, outbuildings, lofts, areas near the door where drafts were worst. Servants were economic assets, so keeping them alive mattered, but they definitely received secondary consideration in warmth allocation. Apprentices living with master craftsmen often slept in workshops, which could be quite cold, especially if the work didn't involve heat-generating activities. Young apprentices might huddle together for warmth, developing bonds that would last their working lives. Medieval cities, with their mixed populations and varied housing, showed these inequalities even more starkly. Wealthy merchants slept in relatively comfortable houses with multiple rooms and heating options. Workers in garrets or cellars suffered much more. The homeless, and medieval cities had homeless populations, faced genuine survival challenges each winter night. Some cities had some charitable provisions, almshouses, church-sponsored shelters, but these were usually overcrowded and themselves barely warm. Sleeping rough in winter could be fatal, and city records occasionally note bodies found frozen in doorways or alleys. There's also an interesting gender dimension to medieval sleeping arrangements. In some cultures and periods, men and women, even married couples, slept separately. This was more common among the wealthy, who could afford separate chambers, and was sometimes linked to religious notions about purity or propriety. But among common people, practical survival overrode such considerations. Married couples slept together, both for intimacy and for warmth. The shared body heat of two adults created a thermal core that could keep both alive through difficult nights. Pregnant women and nursing mothers received special consideration in many households. Their metabolic needs were higher, and their survival directly impacted family welfare. Additional blankets, better positioning relative to the fire, warmer food, these small advantages could make a significant difference. Childbirth in winter was particularly dangerous. Beyond the general risks of medieval childbirth, cold posed additional threats. Newborns, unable to regulate body temperature effectively, could die from exposure even in what adults considered tolerable conditions. Some cultures had specific practices around keeping newborns warm. Swaddling wasn't just about restricting movement, it was thermal insulation. Keeping the baby physically close to mother's body, or another caretaker, ensured continuous warmth. Let's talk about something that might seem strange: communal sleeping among unrelated individuals. Travelers staying at inns or monasteries, soldiers in winter quarters, laborers at seasonal work sites, all these situations involved sleeping near strangers. Medieval inns had a reputation for cramped, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Multiple strangers might share a bed, a necessity driven by both limited space and the logic of shared warmth. This generated its own social norms about behavior: don't thrash, don't snore excessively, don't steal from bed partners, and occasional conflicts when these norms were violated. For female travelers, these arrangements posed additional risks. Women traveling alone were vulnerable to unwanted attention or assault. Some households or inns had separate sleeping areas for women, but this was far from universal. Women sometimes traveled in groups or with male relatives for protection. Military encampments in winter presented commanders with serious challenges. Soldiers needed to remain functional for potential combat, but cold sapped strength and morale. Accounts of winter campaigns mention soldiers sleeping in rows, sharing cloaks and blankets, huddling together for warmth. The famous winter at Valley Forge during the American Revolution, much later than the medieval period, but illustrative, showed how cold could devastate an army more effectively than any enemy. Medieval commanders understood this. Winter campaigns were rare and usually unsuccessful. Prisoners and captives faced particularly harsh conditions. Medieval dungeons and prisons were notoriously cold, and this was partly intentional. Suffering was part of punishment. But it also meant death rates among prisoners spiked in winter. Some prison designs showed marginal consideration for survival: shared cells where body heat could accumulate, occasional provision of straw for bedding, limited heating in areas where valuable prisoners, held for ransom, were kept. But for common criminals, winter imprisonment could be a slow death sentence. We should also mention religious hermits and ascetics who deliberately embraced winter hardship as spiritual practice. Medieval hagiographies, lives of saints, often include episodes of saints enduring bitter cold through faith, presented as miracles or tests of devotion. These accounts probably contain both exaggeration and truth. Humans can, with acclimatization, endure remarkably harsh conditions. Some hermits likely did survive winters in minimal shelters through a combination of physiological adaptation, strategic use of limited resources, and sheer willpower. Others probably died, their failures less publicized than the successes. Now, here's a crucial point about medieval communal sleeping that modern people might miss. It wasn't just physically warm, it was psychologically warming. Winter nights were long, dark, and potentially terrifying. Natural human fear of darkness, cold, and isolation was amplified when those things were genuinely life-threatening. Sleeping surrounded by family, hearing their breathing, knowing you weren't alone in facing the night, this mattered immensely. The psychological comfort of presence reinforced the physical warmth of proximity. Some scholars have argued that medieval people had different psychological boundaries around physical proximity than we do. Constant closeness was normal, not intrusive. Modern concepts of personal space didn't exist in the same way. But we should be careful not to romanticize this. Being cold, uncomfortable, and crowded likely generated plenty of irritation, conflict, and resentment. Medieval sources occasionally mention domestic disputes, and confined winter living surely contributed. The point is that medieval people made trade-offs. Comfort and privacy were sacrificed for survival, and they developed social mechanisms, customs, norms, habits that made this bearable most of the time. As you imagine yourself in this medieval sleeping arrangement, pressed close to family members, hearing multiple people breathing in the darkness, feeling the combined warmth and the inevitable discomforts, try to appreciate both the benefits and costs. You're not cold enough to die tonight. The shared warmth sees to that. But you're not comfortable either. Someone's elbow digs into your ribs. A child whimpers in sleep. The collective smell of unwashed humans and wool is powerful. The straw beneath you rustles with every movement. This is survival medieval style. Not elegant, not pleasant, but effective enough. Another night survived means another chance to see morning, to continue the daily work of living, to make it through to spring. And in that survival, repeated across thousands of households and millions of nights, we see human adaptability at its finest, the ability to create warmth, safety, and even moments of comfort in circumstances that seem, by our standards, nearly unlivable. The social bonds forged in these shared sleeping arrangements, the trust required, the intimacy unavoidable, the cooperation necessary, shaped medieval society in ways we're still understanding. The modern nuclear family in separate rooms is a radical departure from the human norm that medieval communal sleeping represents. As dawn approaches in your imagined medieval night, you begin to stir with the others. The fire needs tending. The new day demands facing. But you made it through. You're alive, cold perhaps, but alive. And that's what mattered. Medieval Europe was not climatically uniform, and winter survival strategies varied significantly based on local conditions. Let's journey through different regions to understand how geography, climate, and available resources shaped sleeping practices. We'll start in Scandinavia, where winter was particularly severe and prolonged. Medieval Scandinavians developed sophisticated cold-weather architecture and practices that would be adopted, to varying degrees, throughout northern Europe. The classic Scandinavian solution was the longhouse, a single large building that housed both family and livestock under one roof, usually with animals at one end and humans at the other. This wasn't just about protecting valuable livestock, it was about harvesting their body heat. A cow, as mentioned earlier, generates considerable warmth. Having a half-dozen cattle, several pigs, and an assortment of smaller animals all housed within the same structure created significant passive heating. The animal end of the house was separated by a partial wall or partition, but heat transfer occurred. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavian longhouses often had insulated walls. Sod roofs and walls several feet thick created substantial thermal mass and insulation. Snow accumulating on these roofs provided additional insulation rather than being cleared away, a counterintuitive but effective strategy. Inside, sleeping platforms were built along the walls, raised significantly above the floor where cold air pooled. These platforms were substantial, sometimes almost like individual room-sized spaces, and were piled with furs, skins, and woven cloth. Scandinavian medieval culture developed specific bedding types suited to extreme cold. Wadmal, a thick, felted woolen cloth, was virtually windproof and water-resistant. Multiple layers of wadmal could keep a person alive in conditions that would kill someone with lighter blankets. Furs were abundant in medieval Scandinavia: bear, wolf, reindeer, seal, and were used extensively for bedding. These weren't necessarily signs of wealth, as they would be farther south, but practical necessities. A household's fur inventory determined its survival prospects each winter. There's evidence suggesting Scandinavians practiced even more extreme communal sleeping than we've discussed. Historical sagas occasionally reference entire families sharing single large sleeping platforms, essentially sleeping in one giant pile for warmth. Now, let's move south to the Alpine regions: Switzerland, Bavaria, northern Italy, the Pyrenees. Mountains created their own unique winter challenges: extreme cold, heavy snow, and isolation when passes became impassable. Alpine peoples developed distinctive housing styles. The classic Swiss chalet design, now romanticized, was originally pure utility. Wide overhanging roofs prevented snow from sliding down onto walls. Multiple stories concentrated warmth, with ground floors sometimes partially buried or used for livestock, creating both protection and passive heating. Wood was the primary construction material in regions with abundant forests. Unlike stone, wood provided some inherent insulation. Timber construction also allowed for tighter joinery that minimized drafts. Alpine winter bedding was heavy on wool and down. Regions with mountain sheep produced exceptionally warm wool suited to local conditions. Goose and duck down, harvested in spring and autumn, filled substantial duvets, early versions of the comforters we know today. The German word Federbett, featherbed, refers to these down-filled covers, which became regionally distinctive. A wealthy Alpine household might have featherbettens so thick and warm that additional covering was unnecessary. Even middling households often managed to acquire at least some down bedding. Interestingly, Alpine people sometimes used what we might call transitional spaces, vestibules, porches, or intermediate rooms, to create thermal airlocks. You didn't enter directly from outside to inside. You passed through a buffer zone where extreme cold could dissipate slightly before penetrating the main living space. Now let's journey to the Low Countries, Flanders, Holland, and the North Sea coast. These regions dealt with different challenges: dampness, wind, and a less severe but more persistently miserable wet cold. Dutch and Flemish medieval housing emphasized wind resistance. Buildings were compact, with relatively small windows and substantial doors. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed rain rather than being insulated against snow. The signature feature of Low Countries sleeping arrangements was the bedstead or box bed, essentially a bed built into a cupboard or alcove, with doors that could be closed. This created a tiny, almost claustrophobic sleeping space, but one that could be kept remarkably warm. A box bed trapped all the sleeper's body heat in a few cubic feet of space. With doors closed and perhaps a hot stone or warming pan, the interior could actually become uncomfortably warm, even on cold nights. This was a radically different approach than the open bed with curtains seen elsewhere. Box beds were often beautifully carved and decorated. They were significant furniture pieces that displayed wealth and craftsmanship. But their primary purpose was thermal survival. Archaeological evidence suggests box beds or similar sleeping closets were used in various forms across northern Europe wherever wood construction allowed. The concept of the enclosed sleeping space appeared independently in multiple cultures as a solution to cold. Moving to England, we find a mix of approaches influenced by both continental and local traditions. English medieval housing varied enormously by region: timber frame construction in the South and Midlands, stone in the North, mixtures everywhere. English medieval sources frequently mention sleeping close to the hall's fire. In typical manor houses, The Great Hall served both as daytime gathering space and nighttime dormitory. The family retired to separate chambers if they could afford them, but servants and lower-status household members slept in the hall itself on benches or temporary pallets. This arrangement meant the hall's fire could be kept burning without the inefficiency of heating multiple rooms. People positioned themselves strategically around the dying fire's warmth. English wool production was significant, and English wool blankets had a reputation for quality. Regional variations existed: Cotswold wool, Welsh wool, each with characteristics making it more or less suitable for bedding. Let's move to the Mediterranean, where winter was less severe but still challenging, particularly given that southern European housing was often designed more for cooling than heating. Italian medieval houses, especially in urban settings, might have little provision for heating beyond small braziers. Winters weren't typically extreme enough to kill, but they could be quite uncomfortable, especially in stone buildings designed to stay cool in summer. Mediterranean winter sleep strategies emphasized portable heating, braziers, heated tiles, heavy textiles, both for clothing and bedding, and communal sleeping in the warmest parts of the house. There's an interesting north-south gradient in how medieval people thought about winter. In Scandinavia, winter was the primary challenge around which all life organized. In the Mediterranean, it was an inconvenient season but not existentially threatening. This shaped both housing and attitudes. Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic regions, combined elements from both Germanic and Slavic traditions. Houses often incorporated stoves rather than open hearths, a technology that provided more efficient heating. The masonry stove or catchelofen, a ceramic-tiled heating structure, could store enormous amounts of heat and release it slowly over many hours. These weren't common everywhere in the medieval period, but where they existed, they transformed winter living. A well-designed masonry stove could be heated once daily, using less fuel than a continuous open fire, while maintaining warmth for up to 24 hours. The technology would eventually spread across Central Europe, but during the medieval period, it was concentrated in certain regions. Scottish and Irish medieval housing dealt with cold through different means. Highland Scottish black houses, low stone structures with thatched roofs and central hearths, sheltered people and animals together, much like Scandinavian longhouses. Irish roundhouses and early rectangular cottages similarly combined human and animal space. The climate was wet rather than freezing, but constant dampness presented its own challenges for sleeping comfort. Now, let's acknowledge something important. We're painting with broad brushes here. Within each region, enormous variation existed based on wealth, local resources, family size, and individual ingenuity. A wealthy merchant in medieval London slept very differently from a Kentish peasant, even though they lived relatively close together. Regional patterns overlay class patterns, and both overlay individual circumstances. What united medieval people across regions was the fundamental challenge: human bodies need warmth to survive, and winter nights threatened that survival. Every culture developed responses based on available resources and inherited wisdom. Some scholars argue for a diffusion model, successful survival strategies spreading from region to region through trade, migration, and communication. Others emphasize independent invention, people in different places solving similar problems with similar solutions. The truth is probably some of both. Medieval Europe had more cultural exchange than we sometimes imagine. Travelers, traders, soldiers, and migrating craftspeople carried ideas alongside goods. But geographical constraints and resource availability meant solutions had to be locally adapted. As you imagine yourself sleeping through winter nights in these different regions, notice how the same core principles apply everywhere. Insulation through layers, utilizing available heat sources, including body heat, creating enclosed sleeping spaces, and communal cooperation. But the specific implementations vary fascinatingly. In Scandinavia, you're under multiple furs on a raised platform with livestock nearby. In the Alps, you're cocooned in a massive down duvet. In Holland, you're enclosed in a box bed. In England, you're curled near the hall fire. In Italy, you're huddled around a brazier under heavy wool. All are attempts to solve the same problem. All represent generations of accumulated wisdom. And all worked well enough that people survived, reproduced, and pass their knowledge forward. Medieval Europe's regional diversity in sleep practices reminds us that there's rarely one right answer to survival challenges. Context matters, resources matter, and inherited cultural practices matter. What works in one place might fail in another. But the underlying human creativity, the determination to survive, the ingenuity in using whatever materials were available, these transcended regional boundaries. Medieval people, whatever their specific circumstances, refused to accept winter's challenge without a fight. As dawn breaks in your imagined medieval night, wherever you are, whether snow covers your Scandinavian longhouse or rain drums on your English cottage roof, you've survived another night. That's what matters. And you'll do it all again tomorrow. Medieval sleep didn't follow our modern pattern of 8 continuous hours. Let's explore how the medieval night was structured, what interrupted sleep, and how people adapted to very different sleep patterns than we experience today. Historical evidence suggests medieval people commonly practiced what researchers call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, sleeping in 2 distinct periods separated by an hour or more of wakefulness in the middle of the night. References to first sleep and second sleep appear throughout medieval literature. People would sleep for 3 or 4 hours after dark, wake naturally for an hour or 2, then sleep again until morning. During the wakeful interval, they might pray, make love, converse quietly, tend the fire, check on animals or children, or simply lie thinking. Some scholars argue this pattern was universal in pre-industrial societies. Others suggest it varied by season, individual, and circumstance. What seems clear is that medieval people didn't expect or attempt uninterrupted sleep the way we do. Why this pattern? Several theories exist. One suggests it's a natural human sleep cycle that artificial lighting and modern schedules have suppressed. The long winter nights, sometimes 14 or 15 hours of darkness, might simply have been too long for continuous sleep. Another theory links it to heating practices. People might wake naturally as the fire burned down and cold increased, tending the fire during the wake period before returning to sleep. Whatever the cause, this segmented sleep structured the medieval night in ways that seem strange to us. Church services followed this rhythm. Midnight prayers and services were scheduled during the natural wake period. Monks in monasteries were explicitly required to wake for matins, the night office. Bells would ring around midnight or 1 a.m., and monks would gather in cold chapels to chant prayers before returning to sleep until dawn. This was seen not as disruption but as proper rhythm. For lay people, the middle of night wake period had different uses. Medieval medical texts recommended it as a healthy time for sexual intimacy. Bodies were rested but not so deeply asleep that arousal was difficult. Practical activities also occurred. Checking the fire was crucial. In winter, letting the fire die completely could be life-threatening, so someone had to ensure coals remained alive. This naturally led to a pattern of waking, checking, perhaps adding wood, then returning to sleep. Security concerns also structured the night. In both rural and urban settings, the dark hours could bring threats, thieves, raiders, wild animals. Watchfulness was prudent. Household members might take turns listening for unusual sounds. The sounds of the medieval night were different from today's. No traffic, no mechanical noises, but plenty of other sounds. Wind in the thatch. Animals outside or in the house. Rodents rustling. The fire's crackle. People breathing, snoring, shifting in sleep. The occasional distant dog bark or owl call. These sounds provided information. Changes in wind direction might signal weather shifts. Unusual animal behavior could indicate predators. The quality of the fire's sound told whether it needed attention. Medieval people developed acute hearing in darkness. Without artificial light, nighttime meant genuine darkness, except for firelight and occasional moonlight through windows. You couldn't rely on vision, so auditory awareness became crucial. Some scholars argue medieval people were more comfortable in darkness than we are. They lived with it daily, knew its patterns and moods. Others suggest darkness held genuine terrors, practical and superstitious. Medieval Christianity taught that night was when demons were most active. Prayers before sleep often included petitions for protection through the night hours. Whether people truly believed demons prowled or simply faced natural fears of darkness is debated, but the darkness clearly held psychological weight. Children learn to manage fear of the dark through these nighttime routines. The presence of family members, the predictable sounds, prayers and rituals, all created framework for handling what was genuinely frightening, long hours of cold darkness with only firelight as barrier against the unknown. Let's talk about morning. People rose with daylight generally, though this varied by season and occupation. In winter, with late dawns, many continued sleeping well past sunrise if work didn't demand earlier rising. Agricultural work was seasonal. Deep winter brought less work, allowing longer sleep. Spring and summer increased labor demands, shortening nights. Medieval people slept more in winter, partly because nights were longer, partly because there was less to do. Social status affected sleep patterns. Peasants rose with dawn to work. Nobility might sleep later, luxury of having others do necessary work. Urban craftspeople followed rhythms set by their trades. Night was generally considered unproductive time, something to be survived rather than utilized. The proverb, early to bed, early to rise, reflects medieval attitudes that staying up late was wasteful or even sinful. But entertainments did occur in evening hours. Storytelling, singing, games by firelight, these filled the hours between supper and sleep. In wealthy households with plentiful candles, social gatherings might extend well into the night. Common people, with more limited lighting, retired earlier. Candles and oil were expenses that had to be justified. Darkness essentially forced sleep as practical matter. You couldn't work in the dark, so you might as well rest. This created interesting dynamics. Medieval evenings were social but not in our way. People gathered around the fire, talked, worked on tasks that didn't require bright light, hand sewing, spinning, simple crafts, then eventually drifted to sleep. The transition from wakefulness to sleep was gradual. You didn't change into pajamas, brush teeth, and climb into a separate room's bed. You simply moved from your sitting position to lying down, perhaps adding another blanket, and closed your eyes. This fluidity between waking and sleeping, no sharp boundary, just a gentle transition, characterized medieval rest. Sleep was part of the continuous flow of life, not a separated, ritualized event as we make it. Dreams held significance in medieval culture. Religious teaching suggested dreams could be messages from God, warnings of danger, glimpses of the future. But they could also be demonic deceptions or simply meaningless sleep phantoms. Interpretation of dreams was complex, subject to theological debate and popular belief. Some dreams were written down and preserved, especially if they seemed prophetic or significant. Most were forgotten or shared as morning conversation. Nightmares. The word itself derives from medieval belief in a mare or demon that caused bad dreams, were both feared and explained through religious frameworks. Prayers and charms existed to ward off nightmares. The quality of medieval sleep probably varied enormously. Physical discomfort, cold, hard surfaces, vermin, crowding, likely meant frequent waking and restless sleep. But exhaustion from physical labor also meant people could fall asleep despite discomfort. Modern sleep studies suggest humans can adapt to less than ideal sleep conditions if they're chronic. Medieval people probably reached homeostasis with their sleep environment, not ideal, but functional. Some nights were certainly worse than others. Extreme cold could prevent sleep entirely, leaving people lying awake, shivering, waiting for dawn. Illness, pain, or worry similarly disrupted rest. But most nights, most people managed some sleep. The patterns and rhythms we've discussed, segmented sleep, communal warmth, carefully tended fires, enabled survival. As morning approaches in our medieval night, you hear subtle changes. The darkness begins to lift, not yet dawn, but the pre-dawn gray that signals night's end. Someone stirs, feeds the fire properly. Cold air brings new awareness. Time to wake, time to move. The medieval morning began gradually, like the night ended, no alarm clocks, no sharp transitions. You woke as your body was ready, as light allowed, as work demanded. Sleeping through winter nights in medieval times wasn't about achieving perfect rest. It was about surviving until morning, protecting the vulnerable, maintaining enough functionality to continue daily life. And night after night, through the long winter months, people did this. They managed. They developed rhythms and strategies that worked well enough. They passed their knowledge to the next generation, who refined and adapted it. The medieval night, with all its discomforts and challenges, was met with human ingenuity and determination. Sleep became another battlefield where people fought winter's siege, using fire, fabric, cooperation, and sheer endurance as their weapons. And morning, when it came, was victory renewed. Not everyone faced winter nights with equal resilience. Let's explore how medieval society managed the sleep and survival of those most vulnerable to cold. We'll start with infants and young children. Newborns are particularly susceptible to hypothermia. They can't shiver effectively to generate heat, their surface area to body mass ratio is unfavorable, and they're utterly dependent on adult care. Medieval mothers knew this instinctively. Keeping infants warm was paramount. The practice of swaddling, wrapping babies tightly in cloth bands, served multiple purposes, but thermal regulation was crucial among them. Swaddling kept arms and legs immobilized against the body's core, reducing surface area exposed to cold. Multiple layers of linen or wool created insulation. The tight wrapping held in body heat that might otherwise dissipate. Infants slept with or very near their mothers. The proximity provided constant warmth and allowed easy nighttime feeding. In many cases, babies essentially shared body heat with mothers throughout the night. This closeness created risks. Overlay death, where an adult accidentally suffocated an infant while sleeping, was a known danger. Church records mention it. Medieval people worried about it. Yet the warmth-sharing necessity outweighed the risks for most families. Some households used cradles, wooden boxes, or baskets that could be placed near the fire, creating a small, warm environment for the infant. The cradle could be rocked when the baby fussed, an innovation that kept adults from having to fully wake. As children grew past infancy, they graduated through different sleeping arrangements. Toddlers might still sleep with parents or be moved to sleep with siblings. The goal was always to pair vulnerable small bodies with larger, warmer ones. Young children generated their own challenges. They kicked in sleep, woke crying, needed to relieve themselves, creating dampness that threatened warmth. Managing these disruptions while maintaining survival conditions required patience and strategy. Some medieval sources mention children wetting beds, which in cold conditions could be dangerous. Wet bedding lost insulating value. Strategies for managing this included careful evening fluid restriction and waking children to use chamber pots. The very old faced opposite challenges. Where children gradually developed thermal regulation abilities, the elderly gradually lost them. Aging metabolism slowed, body mass decreased, movement limitations reduced heat generation through activity. Medieval households recognized elders' vulnerability. Priority positioning near fires, extra blankets, better quality bedding. These weren't just respect for age but practical survival measures. But resources were limited. A household couldn't always provide everything needed. Some elderly people simply didn't survive winter, succumbing to cold-related complications. Medieval people accepted this with a resignation that seems harsh to us but was realistic given their circumstances. Grandparents who remained functional, providing childcare, craft skills, wisdom, received better care than those who were disabled or senile. This harsh calculus reflected survival priorities in resource-limited households. Some elderly people developed techniques for staying warm. Staying active during the day to generate body heat, wearing multiple clothing layers even indoors, positioning themselves strategically, these small adaptations helped. Medieval medical theories about aging bodies suggested they were naturally colder and drier. Remedies included warming foods and drinks, gentle exercise, and additional external heat. Whether these truly helped or were placebo is debatable, but they reflected attempt to address elders' thermal needs. The chronically ill and disabled faced particular vulnerabilities. Someone with restricted mobility couldn't generate heat through movement. Many illnesses involved fever cycles that disrupted temperature regulation. Pain could prevent restful sleep even when warmth was adequate. Medieval medicine had limited effective treatments for most conditions. Managing someone through a winter illness meant keeping them warm, fed, and hydrated while hoping their body could fight off whatever afflicted them. Hospitals and infirmaries existed, usually run by religious orders. These institutions tried to provide better conditions for the sick than most could receive at home: separate beds, dedicated fires, specialized diets. But hospital care was limited and often inadequate. Resources were stretched. Understanding of disease was limited. Many people who entered medieval hospitals didn't leave alive, especially in winter when weakened patients couldn't fight both illness and cold. Families caring for sick members at home did their best with limited resources. The sick person might get the warmest sleeping spot. Others sacrificed comfort to provide extra covering for the patient. This represented genuine sacrifice. Giving up your share of warmth could mean a miserable night. We should discuss mental illness and disability, topics medieval people understood differently than we do. Someone with severe mental illness might not understand the need to stay covered, to remain near the fire, to cooperate in survival strategies. Managing such individuals through winter required constant vigilance. Family members had to monitor that blankets stayed in place, that the person didn't wander into cold areas, that basic needs were met even when the individual couldn't or wouldn't cooperate. Medieval society had no concept of what we'd call patient rights or disability accommodation. Treatment of the mentally ill varied from compassionate family care to neglect or abuse. Winter survival for such individuals depended heavily on having family willing and able to provide intensive care. Let's talk about pregnancy and childbirth in winter. Pregnant women had higher metabolic needs but also faced physical restrictions as pregnancy progressed. Finding comfortable sleeping positions while heavily pregnant, in a hard medieval bed, while trying to stay warm, was challenging. Childbirth itself was dangerous anytime, but winter added complications. Cold birthing rooms, inadequate heating, difficulty keeping both mother and newborn warm immediately after birth, all increased risks. Medieval midwives understood the importance of warmth. Birthing rooms would be heated as much as possible. Multiple fires, closed shutters, extra people present, providing body heat, all helped create survivable conditions. But resources limited what could be done. Fuel was expensive. Not every family could afford to heat a room substantially for days around a birth. Some women gave birth in essentially unheated spaces, relying on the heat of their own labor and the presence of attendants to survive. Newborns in winter required extraordinary vigilance. Keeping them warm through those first crucial hours and days demanded constant attention. Many medieval infants died in their first weeks, and cold certainly contributed to mortality. Medieval people developed practices to improve infant survival. Keeping the baby close to mother's body, wrapping in multiple layers, careful attention to the fire, these represented accumulated wisdom about what worked. Some cultures had specific post-birth seclusion periods where mother and infant essentially stayed in bed, kept warm and protected, for days or weeks. This served both hygiene and thermal purposes. Let's discuss something grim: child mortality. Medieval children died at rates that horrify modern people. Perhaps 30 to 50% didn't survive to adulthood, depending on time and place. Winter cold contributed significantly to this mortality. Respiratory infections hit hard in cold, crowded, smoky environments. Weakened immune systems couldn't fight disease. Malnutrition, more common in late winter as stored food depleted, reduced resistance. Parents lived with the very real possibility that children might not survive winter. This shaped medieval psychology. People loved their children but couldn't afford the level of emotional investment modern parents make. Loss was too common. This doesn't mean parents didn't grieve. Medieval sources include poignant expressions of parental grief over lost children. But there was also a degree of emotional protection, an attempt not to become too attached before a child proved likely to survive. How does this relate to sleep? Because nighttime, when the child was most vulnerable, when you couldn't watch constantly, when cold pressed hardest, this was when parents lost children. Morning checks to ensure all children had survived the night were routine. Some families had warning signs: a child seeming unusually cold, difficulty waking, unusual pallor. These symptoms meant urgent action, more covering, closer proximity to fire or other warmth sources, possibly warming drinks if the child could swallow. But sometimes there was nothing to be done. A child might simply not wake up, whether from cold, illness, or overlay, or some combination. Medieval parents knew this possibility haunted every winter night. Let's end this difficult section with something more hopeful: the strategies that worked. The accumulated knowledge about keeping vulnerable individuals alive through winter. Priority positioning in the warmest spots. Extra layers of covering. Continuous monitoring through the night. Sharing body heat strategically. Adjusting sleeping arrangements to protect the vulnerable even at cost to the healthy. These practices, refined over generations, saved lives. They weren't perfect, couldn't be, given resource limitations and limited understanding. But they represented the best medieval people could do with what they had. And many vulnerable people did survive. Children grew up. Elders lived to pass their wisdom forward. The sick recovered. Medieval families successfully protected those who needed extra care often enough to maintain populations and continue society. As you imagine yourself in a medieval bed, perhaps with a young child nestled against you, or positioned to help an aging parent, or watching over a sick sibling, feel the responsibility. The night is dangerous. Your vigilance matters. Your warmth is literally life-giving. This was the reality of medieval winter nights for those caring for the vulnerable. It was exhausting. It was stressful. It was a responsibility that couldn't be escaped or deferred. But people managed it. Night after night, winter after winter, they protected those who couldn't protect themselves. And in that care, we see perhaps the most admirable aspect of medieval survival: the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for others' survival. Dawn comes. You check the child beside you, still breathing, still warm. Relief floods through you. Another night survived. You did your job. And tonight, you'll do it all again. Despite all the strategies we've discussed, medieval winter survival wasn't guaranteed. Let's explore what happened when systems failed, when people didn't wake up in the morning. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention particularly severe winters. The winter of 1315 to 1316, part of the Great Famine period, brought extreme cold across northern Europe. Chronicles describe rivers freezing solid, animals dying in their barns, and people perishing from exposure even in their homes. During these extreme events, normal survival strategies proved inadequate. Fuel supplies ran out. Stored food depleted. Weakened bodies couldn't maintain body heat. The death toll rose sharply. Though precise numbers are impossible to determine, medieval record-keeping wasn't systematic enough to track mortality accurately. Sometimes failure was sudden. A fire went out overnight, temperatures dropped unexpectedly, and by morning, a household was dead or dying. Church records occasionally note entire families found frozen. More often, failure was gradual. Cold weakened bodies over days and weeks. Malnutrition reduced the body's ability to generate heat. Respiratory infections, encouraged by smoky, crowded conditions, compromised lung function. People slowly lost the battle against winter. One particularly vulnerable time was late winter, when fuel and food reserves ran lowest. Households that had managed through December and January might fail in March, just as spring approached. The cruelest timing. Survival seemed within reach, but resources proved insufficient to last. Individual tragedies occurred frequently. An elderly person might not wake one morning. A baby might be found cold and still. These deaths, while devastating to families, were common enough that communities had established grieving rituals and support systems. Let's talk about something particularly tragic: orphans. When parents died, children faced immediate survival crises. Who would provide the warmth, protection, and resources orphan children needed? Medieval society had systems for dealing with orphans: extended family, community charity, church institutions, apprenticeships that included room and board. But these weren't always adequate, and winter mortality among orphans was high. Some communities were better than others at protecting vulnerable individuals. Strong social networks and community cooperation improved survival chances. Isolated households or those without support systems faced higher risks. Urban poverty created winter tragedies that were perhaps even more desperate than rural ones. Cities had homeless populations, people without shelter who faced winter with no resources beyond whatever charity they could find. Medieval cities had some charitable institutions. Churches might provide shelter. Wealthy individuals might distribute food or fuel. But resources were limited and demand high. Many homeless people didn't survive winter. The bodies of those who froze to death in city streets were occasionally mentioned in records, usually just notes in mortality books, numbers without names or stories. These anonymous dead remind us that medieval social safety nets, such as they were, had large gaps. Let's discuss building fires and how they contributed to winter mortality. Yes, fire was necessary for survival, but it was also dangerous. Houses burned. People died. Fire could start from hearth sparks, tipped candles, careless handling of rushes or straw. Once started in wooden or thatched buildings, fire spread rapidly. Winter added particular danger. People were more likely to be asleep when fires started, reaction time was slower, and attempts to flee into brutal cold created additional mortality. Entire neighborhoods could burn. Medieval cities experienced devastating fires regularly. London's medieval history includes multiple major fires. Wooden construction, thatched roofs, narrow streets, and reliance on open flames created perfect conditions for disaster. Winter fires were particularly tragic because they destroyed not just buildings but also stored food and fuel, the resources needed for survival through the rest of the season. A family whose house burned in January faced not just immediate trauma but months of hardship. Carbon monoxide poisoning was another fire-related risk, though medieval people didn't understand the mechanism. They knew that poorly ventilated fires or certain types of fuel, especially charcoal, could cause deadly, bad air. Some deaths attributed to natural causes were probably carbon monoxide poisoning. Medieval houses were small and often tightly sealed against cold, perfect conditions for CO buildup. People would fall asleep and simply not wake up. Without understanding the chemistry, they couldn't fully protect themselves. Some preventive wisdom existed. Don't sleep with charcoal fires, maintain ventilation, but not everyone followed these guidelines, especially when cold was severe and the temptation to seal every gap and use every heating source was strong. Let's talk about accidents. Someone might get up in the night to tend the fire and stumble, falling into flames. Children might knock over candles. A sick person might kick off covering and become hypothermic before anyone noticed. These individual accidents added up to significant mortality. While any single incident was rare, across thousands of households each night, accidents happened regularly. Medieval sources occasionally mention preventive measures. Training children in fire safety, securing candles properly, checking on vulnerable household members. These practices developed because people recognized the dangers. But preventing all accidents was impossible. Houses were dark, people were tired, winter created hazardous conditions. Some accidents were inevitable despite best efforts. We should also discuss suicide and despair. Winter's hardship, the grinding poverty, the loss of loved ones, the endless cold and darkness, these could break people psychologically. Medieval Christianity strongly condemned suicide, considering it a grave sin. Church burial was denied to suicides. Despite this, people still took their own lives, and winter likely saw a peak in such tragedies. The records rarely discuss suicide explicitly. The stigma meant families tried to conceal it when possible. But careful reading of chronicles and church records reveals hints of self-inflicted deaths, particularly during harsh winters. Economic factors contributed to winter mortality in complex ways. Poor families couldn't afford adequate fuel, food, or bedding. Their houses were poorly maintained, with more drafts and less insulation. They worked longer hours for less pay, becoming exhausted and susceptible to cold-related illness. Wealth didn't guarantee survival. Even nobles could die if caught in blizzards or if castle heating failed catastrophically, but it certainly improved odds. The correlation between poverty and winter mortality was strong. Medieval society recognized this to some degree. Charity increased in winter. Churches collected alms specifically for cold weather relief. Some lords reduced rents or provided extra resources to their tenants in harsh winters. But these measures were inadequate to the scale of need. Many suffered and died while others were relatively comfortable. This inequality was accepted as natural order. Medieval people didn't expect fairness as we understand it. Let's discuss something often overlooked: winter's psychological toll. The long dark nights, the constant cold, the threat of death, the loss of loved ones, all created what we might call seasonal affective disorder, though medieval people had no such term. Contemporary sources mention melancholy increasing in winter. People withdrew, became less active, struggled with low mood. Modern understanding of vitamin D deficiency, reduced sunlight, and psychological effects of chronic stress help us interpret these medieval observations. Did this contribute to mortality? Probably indirectly. Depression reduced self-care, decreased appetite, lowered immunity. People experiencing severe depression might give up, stop fighting for survival. In a context where active effort was required just to stay alive, loss of will could be fatal. Medieval religious framework provided some protection. Faith gave meaning to suffering, community worship provided social connection, hope of heaven offered consolation. But it wasn't always enough. As we conclude this difficult chapter, let's acknowledge something important. Despite all the tragedies, despite all the failures, despite all the deaths, the majority survived. Most people who went to sleep on winter nights did wake up in the morning. The strategies worked more often than they failed. The knowledge was sufficient, if not perfect. The social structures provided support, if not for everyone. Medieval people achieved remarkable survival rates given their limited resources. But the failures mattered. Each death was a person, a story, a loss. Families grieved. Communities mourned. The tragedies shaped medieval consciousness. Everyone knew someone who didn't survive a winter. This awareness of mortality's proximity informed medieval psychology. Life was precious because it was fragile. Survival was celebrated because it wasn't guaranteed. Community bonds mattered because you might need help to survive, or might be called to help others. As you imagine yourself in this medieval night, feeling the cold pressing in, hearing the wind howl, aware that despite all your preparations, survival isn't certain, sit with that awareness. It's uncomfortable. It's frightening. But it's also clarifying. What matters becomes obvious. Staying alive matters. Protecting those you love matters. The simple fact of seeing another dawn matters. Medieval people lived with this clarity every winter night. And in that clarity, despite the fear and the loss and the grinding hardship, they found reason to keep going, to keep preparing, to keep fighting. Because morning would come. Spring would follow. Life would continue. And most of them would be there to see it. And now, as our journey through medieval winter nights draws to a close, let's return to your own bed. Your own time. Your own warm, safe, comfortable sleeping space. Feel your pillow beneath your head, soft, clean, supporting you perfectly. Feel your mattress, engineered for comfort, free of pests, keeping your body aligned in healthy position. Feel your blankets, light yet warm, clean and dry, needing no careful maintenance or repair. Notice the temperature. Your room is warm, not from carefully tended fires or shared body heat, but from climate control systems that work automatically, requiring no thought from you. The air is clean, no smoke, no dampness, just comfortable breathing. You are safe. You are warm. You have survived this imaginary medieval night, and now you can rest in the comfort your own era provides. Take a moment to feel gratitude for this. For the engineers who designed your heating system. For the workers who built your home. For the manufacturers who created your bedding. For the vast infrastructure of modern life that makes your comfort possible. Medieval people would view your sleeping conditions as almost miraculous. The steady warmth, the soft bed, the freedom from vermin, the security from cold-related death, all would seem like luxuries beyond imagining. And they'd be right. You are luxuriously comfortable by the standards of most human history. The warmth you take for granted represents technological and social achievements built over centuries. Let that awareness settle into your body. Feel how your muscles can relax completely because you're not fighting cold. Notice how your breathing is easy because the air is clean. Recognize that you can sleep deeply because survival doesn't require vigilance. As you drift toward sleep now, carry forward this appreciation. Tomorrow, when you wake in a warm room, take a moment to feel grateful. When you adjust your thermostat, remember those who had only fire and blankets. When you complain about your bed, recall those who slept on straw. This isn't about guilt. It's about perspective. Understanding how others lived helps us appreciate what we have. Knowing the struggles of the past makes the present's comforts more conscious, more valuable. Medieval people's ingenuity in the face of winter's challenge should inspire us. They took basic materials, fire, fiber, and cooperation, and built survival systems that worked often enough to bring humanity through thousands of winters. You are descended from people who survived winter nights. Your ancestors, whether genetic or cultural, mastered the art of staying alive through cold and darkness. That resilience is part of your heritage. As your eyes grow heavy, as your breathing deepens, as sleep approaches, feel connected to all those medieval sleepers. You share something fundamental with them: the human need for rest, the vulnerability of sleep, the relief of surviving until morning. But you also have what they longed for: warmth without effort, safety without vigilance, comfort without compromise. Rest now in that comfort. Let your body relax completely. Trust your climate control systems, your secure shelter, your soft bedding. All of it is working to give you what medieval people could only dream of: a perfect night's sleep. The stories of medieval winter sleep remind us that human beings are remarkably adaptable. We can survive in challenging conditions. We can innovate solutions with limited resources. We can support each other through hardship. But they also remind us that we don't have to suffer unnecessarily. Progress has value. Modern comfort isn't something to feel guilty about. It's an achievement to celebrate, built on the struggles and innovations of those who came before. So sleep well. Sleep deeply. Sleep in the knowledge that you have something precious: a warm, safe night's rest that medieval people fought for with every tool at their disposal, and which you can simply enjoy. Your bedroom is not a medieval chamber. Your bed is not a straw-filled sack. Your night is not a battle against cold. Your night is peaceful. Your rest is assured. Your comfort is complete. Let yourself sink into sleep now, carried by the knowledge of history, grateful for the present, and secure in the warmth that surrounds you. The medieval night taught us many lessons. Perhaps the most important is this: never take warmth for granted. Never take safety for granted. Never take a good night's sleep for granted. Because you have something remarkable. Something people once died without. Something that represents centuries of human progress. You have a warm place to sleep. And that is a gift beyond measure. Rest now. Sleep well. And tomorrow, when you wake warm and comfortable, remember for just a moment those who woke cold or didn't wake at all. Then go forward with gratitude, living your warm, comfortable life with awareness of how precious it truly is. Good night. Sweet dreams. And may your sleep be as peaceful as medieval people could only imagine.